Okay, thanks Reynolds for the introduction. Hello everybody. Welcome from my living room in Austria in lockdown. I'm very happy to speak here in the HackMotion webinar series. Thanks a lot again. My topic today is I'm going to talk about common amateur swing faults and how to fix them using HackMotion wrist data, and I'm talking about the lead hand only, obviously, today. I've been as Reynolds said, a HackMotion user since 2018. I measured hundreds of golf swings, professional swings, amateur swings. And normally if you buy a tool, sometimes you just put it away and think you're not going to use it anyway after a month or two. But in this case, I've been using HackMotion basically every day the last 3 years I was teaching. Not in every lesson, but probably every day, I would say, and it has been very helpful, especially because HackMotion helped me as a measuring device and especially as a feedback tool, which is something amateur golfers really, really enjoy. I've been talking about the biofeedback tones you can put in, the bad tones, the good tones. That's been very, very helpful, and the amateur golfers love it. Today, I'm going to talk about swing faults and about basically also for golfers who are amateur golfers who bought this system, how they can detect stuff, and also for coaches who starting new with this. So this is not a very in-depth presentation. It's my observations of stuff I really often see with working with amateur golfers. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about is the grip and the setup. It's not a swing fault per se, but many swing faults can occur from grip and setup, as you might know. And if I calibrate the sensor correctly, like you mentioned before, Reynolds, I put in a flat surface, and I always see that it's the same thing. You're 0. So if you go this way, this is called an extension, and this is flexion. Yeah, if you're not aware of this, it's very typical that when you have a grip from a solid player, he has some amount of extension in his wrist, and typically it's somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees. Please don't take me absolutely by the word, because Bryson DeChambeau, we know he's actually in flexion when he's in the setup, but it's a benchmark I think you could look at when you look at a grip. So if I see a grip with the HackMotion, and I look at these tiles, this is a screenshot basically you see on the top on the right here from the HackMotion software, and if I see a number like, let's say, 4 degrees, it doesn't mean the end of the world yet, but it means just for me I'm going to have a close look at this grip, because typically two things occur. One thing is the player has the grip too much in his palm, which causes a lot of where he takes a lot of extension out of his grip, so he will get a very, very flat grip. And the second thing is if the grip is too weak, meaning that the grip is turned too much to the left as a right-handed player. So this is very typical. So only if I see this number, I will look at that. By the way, 4 degrees is basically nothing. So you will not see 4 degrees. It's basically just something you can measure with a device. This is just to show you what I'm looking for. Also, when you have a number like this, I always say below 10. I mean, it can be basically anything, but below 10 is something where I open my eyes. It's also a very high chance that the player has excessive shaft lean in this direction here. That will take out a lot out of the extension part here in the beginning. So whether if you're a coach, you prefer this coaching style, okay. If you're an amateur golfer, just something you want to look at, maybe it's maybe not the best way to have the grip in the palm and too weak. Yeah, so just think about that. The second thing I see in a lot of swings, I call it lead wrist breakdown. Basically meaning that the lead wrist, when it comes into the impact zone, starts to break down towards extension. This is called extension here. Okay, and as Reynolds said before in the introduction, he said that it's very typical that elite players lose about 20 to 25, some to 30, some to 15, but let's say 20 to 25 degrees of extensions are being lost from setup position into the impact zone. So that's something you want to look at. And on the right screenshot here, on the top screenshot, I have a player who actually is adding a lot of extension. You can see the address position. He has a certain amount of extension already. There are no values. I don't think the values, by the way, are very important. It's just, I'm just looking basically at the change how the things are changing. And you can see this player on the top right, he's changing a lot. So he adds a lot of wrist extension. Then you can see from the top towards impact, he gets down again, basically to where he was, but still he's in the same, more or less the same extension as he was at setup, which means he will add quite a bit of loft. He will have problems with radius control, low point, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't have to be, but it's very likely that it can be. Second thing which happens as a breakdown is the screenshot number 2, where he actually does a pretty good job in the backswing, getting, I would say, a little bit rid of extension towards flexion, and then also does a good job in the early downswing. But then before it comes to the ball, he just adds everything again. I mean, that's a way, adding something in the end is something you can do, but you don't want to add too much. Okay, I think if I remember correctly, Scott Cox talked about this last year in the PGA show about the wrist options A, B, C, and D. And this was, I think, wrist option B, where he said you go from flexion towards extension, but you don't want to go too much into extension. And this is so those two patterns you can see are very typical what I see for amateur golfers. So just look at the address position, at impact position, and see if there's a difference. That's something I really like to focus at. There are some fixes for that. I like to, if I find a player who has these problems, I just make him aware of it. So I like to tell him where he has to go, and I basically let him do little 9 to 3 swings from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and giving a good idea that's the wrist condition he wants to be in. Normally, his pivot works starts to be better and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go too much into detail today, but that's a very good exercise. On the top right, you can see that was actually me a couple of days ago trying a 9 to 3 swing, and I did a pretty good job getting the extension away towards impact, as you can see, and that's something that works really nicely. And the other drill, I really had a lot of success. I call the mic drop drill. Actually, I did a little YouTube video about this. It's in German, I'm afraid, but if you probably Google on YouTube mic drop drill, my name, you will probably find it, and you will kind of see at least what it looks like, even though it's in German. And basically, I'm doing 9 to 3 swings, and I'm excessively exaggerating the wrist flexion to the impact zone. So it's not a shot you hit very hard, just very gentle, I would say. And the idea is that the club basically still hangs down all the way, points towards the floor when you finish, and then you drop the mic. So I drop the club, and if the club falls on the floor like this, with the club face first, the player did it correctly, but most of the times people let the grip land on the floor. You can see on the bottom here, me doing the mic drop drill. So I had a lot of success, and I know many of my German-speaking colleagues sent me messages that their students did very great improvements doing that. The next thing I like to do is Goldilocks, too much, too little, too less, Goldilocks. So I let them exaggerate the wrong direction. I try to get them in the exaggerated portion here, and just right. So, and I like to use HackMotion wrist data to check and tell them, okay, that's the correct feeling, whatever, and also use biofeedback, of course. So that's about lead wrist breakdown, something you want to look at. Next thing I want to talk about is excessive radial deviation. It goes a little hand in hand with the breakdown of the wrist, but I took it as an extra fault. I work quite a bit with professional players, and something I really always saw is that they only add radial deviation. That's radial deviation, by the way. So you go up like here, cocking, wrist cocking, and wrist uncocking. That's ulnar deviation, radial deviation. So I'm talking about wrist cocking up. And other players I've been working with, they had like 20, 30, 40 degrees from setup to top of backswing. So they're not adding a crazy ton of wrist cock here in the backswing. And that's on the lower picture here on the right, you can see basically a pro. I think actually he's from the HackMotion database. He's adding like only 30 degrees or something, or 20 degrees. And so that's something very typical, that they don't add a lot of radial. on the top, you can see an amateur golfer who excessively cocks his wrists up. And you can see it goes very up, very steep, the curve, very aggressively. And the thing is, every time you radial deviate, so cock your wrist up, you will also get your wrist into extension. Okay, so they're like married. Okay, so radial deviation and extension are basically married to each other. And you can see the moment the player on the top starts cocking his wrist up, the extension goes up as well. And so this is something you want to really look at, that you don't radial deviate too much. Okay, so I don't want to put a clear benchmark, but I always say like 20 to 40 degrees is probably enough for most golfers. Also, the fixed idea of trying to hold lag in the downswing or excessively trying to use the wrists is something that causes problems, because basically what it does is brings the club on very difficult planes. It brings the club face in difficult positions. Normally, it opens the club face if you excessively radial deviate. If you go the other direction, the club face tends to close. The takeaway here is, please don't overuse the wrists. So when I have somebody with excessive radial deviation, I like to tend to use a underloading pattern, meaning that they try to not really use their wrists in the backswing. I like the feeling that they have an umbrella, like they in the rain, and this is an umbrella, and they have to stay dry, not this way, dry. And many times you see that they're using a grip which is very, very light, because maybe they are told to do it, to grip the club lightly. And sometimes it really helps if you grip the club a little bit firmer. Just keep that in mind. The next thing I want to talk about is the steepening move. So basically, the shaft tipping in this direction, you can call it over the top, you can call it coming from the outside or whatever. It's something which normally doesn't do any good for the golfers. It causes basically slides, it causes shanks, it causes other things which are not very good for the score. And so it's very typical in professional swings that the club shallows a little bit. Okay, at least it doesn't steepen, I would say. And you can have a look at the rotation graph in HackMotion. So it's sometimes very difficult to see, but I gave you two examples. On the top right, you can see the lead hand pronation, supination. So if you do this here, basically the graph will go down. If you go this way, it will go up. So on the top here, you see a shallowing move where you can see where the graph actually goes down towards the top of backswing, towards the transition. It goes a little bit down. So that's a shallowing move I typically see when I work with my better players. And on the lower picture, there's a move where it's steepening, where it goes a little bit in this direction. This guy is not very excessive, but he's steepening. And it is something you want to look at. Many times, of course, it's also a combination of the other things like the flexion, extension, and the radial deviation, the ulnar deviation. All the combinations are very important. And sometimes if you work on this stuff here and the other things, you will get a better rotation graph as well and better contact. But it's something you maybe want to look at. So as a fix, it's very good to understand the concept of how the wrists work in the downswing. I think actually Monty Scheinblum is going to talk a little bit about this later. So I'm really looking forward for his presentation. Yeah, you can check it with the HackMotion, of course, if you try to change something, if it's changing. I like to use like a smart ball, or like I have a little soccer ball here, which you can put it between your arms here and do little swings. I'm basically trying to push the trail elbow against the ball during the downswing. That normally shallows also the lead arm a little bit and shallows the club. I like working a lot on elbow structure. That really, really helps the whole thing. If people get all crazy with elbows in this direction, it's not the thing you really want. Okay, so I'm coming to number 5. So now we talk about swing timing. I think this is the most overlooked tile HackMotion has in the software, because you look at the graphs, you look at the flexion extension, the rotation graphs, everything, but this is also there. And this is something you really want to look at as well, because it's very typical that professionals have a backswing time, so I mean from setup to the top of backswing from 0.7 to 0.95 seconds. That's very typical. And they need about a third of that the way down. So very typical would be 0.75 seconds backswing, and then from top of backswing to the impact zone, 0.25, so a third of the time. So a ratio from 1 to 3. That's very, very typical. Many times when I coach amateur golfers, I see numbers above 1 second. So this, the one you see here, is like 1.22. That's very typical, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. The problem with that is that there is no dynamic motion. So if somebody really starts going back so slowly, he's trying to steer the whole swing. You will not generate any forces into the ground. You will not get a very good structure in your swing at all. So I found it's very helpful to make especially amateur golfers aware of their backswing time, because maybe many think, oh, I have to be very, very slow, long and slow in the backswing, and that's not doing really good for many of them. I'm not saying it's bad for everybody, but my experience is it's not very good. And if I let them play around with different backswing times, okay, so let's do it really quick and just a little bit faster and in between, or maybe also Goldilocks, where say even slower than you did, much faster than you did, and maybe something in between. That also helped a lot. And I like to check the numbers then again on the tiles, what actually the time was. So that's something I really look at, and you also should be looking at it. Okay, so let's have a little recap again from the 5 faults you can detect with HackMotion. I mean, there's obviously much more you can detect, but I only had time for a 25-minute presentation here, and I thought I wanted to share with you the most important things I see. So the first one we talked about, the grip and the setup. So if you have a number below 10 degrees of extension, you might want to look at the grip and also at the setup if there's too much shaft lean. There also could be too much ulnar deviation as well. So just depending on your coaching style, if you're a coach or if you're an amateur golfer using this device, just be aware that you want to have probably a number above 10 degrees. That's my experience. That works quite nicely. The second thing we talked about was the lead wrist breakdown. I find it very beneficial if amateur golfers start learning to have less extension at the impact than at setup. The more they come towards the 20 degrees, the better it becomes normally, and they get a very nice structure, also very nice elbow structure, better body pivot and all that kind of stuff comes with it, better side bends. Watch out for radial deviation, wrist cocking up. So don't overdo this here. Trying to hold lag can be a very hurtful thing in a golf swing. This is something I really hear a lot. People talking about it, trying to create lag. That's probably not the way you want to do it, but that's my opinion. The steepening move, just look at the graph, maybe how the lead arm is working in the transition phase. Work on shallowing moves and stuff like that. And last, we talked about the swing timing, about 0.75 to 0.95 being a very solid backswing time. By the way, this is also for irons and for woods. So it's very typical that there's not a big difference. Thank you very much. It was great presenting for you. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christoph. Really great presentation. A lot of good insights. I have some questions here from the audience. So one is, would you, regarding steepening and downswing, would you work more flexion, as the Mary says that she noticed many players extending more in transition? So would you be working on flexion?
Yeah, a very high correlation. So Mary is asking if I work on this move here. Absolutely. I mean, the moment people are trying to hold lag and adding extension, it's very typical that this gets steep. So a very good strategy is, as I said before, it's a very good to learn the right moves, the right wrist movements. I also like giving the people a feeling of ulnar deviation going down. Okay, so ulnar and down, and moving the club behind you. But I'm sure Monty Schemprem is going to talk more about this later. But basically the answer is yes. I mean, I've never seen good things when extension happened in downswings for amateur players.
Yeah. Then there is one question about how extension flexion data changes for mid-handicap players between mid-irons and driver, so between different clubs. Flexion extension change.
Well, you mean when they do it wrong? Or,
I think if I understand correctly, the question is how is driver swing different from mid-iron swing?
So the question is if the wrist data changes in general. Yeah. Not really, to be honest. I would say maybe it does a little bit, but the pattern is very similar. I would say that's the best answer. I wouldn't expect completely different things.
Yeah. Then actually there is in the data library some tour players also for both iron and driver, and you compare, and the data usually is quite similar, as Christoph says.
Yeah, that's okay.
Then one interesting point you raised about rotation. I think this might be a good moment to maybe slowly just explain what is global rotation, why we call it global. So basically what we would call local rotation would be if you'd measure it relative to the elbow. So that would mean that you are rotating, and that would be pronating, supinating the forearm. However, that means that you need another sensor here, and we don't want to complicate the system with multiple sensors. We want to keep it simple. So what we provide is the sensor reading from this sensor here on the forearm. However, you can rotate it in two ways, at least. One is you rotate your hand like this, and you rotate your body like this. So both of them are rotating the sensor in what you call not local reference frame, but more like in the global reference frame. So that's why we call it global rotation. And you can, there are two ways that are interesting to look at. One is actually when Christoph showed, when the player is at the top of the backswing, you can see whether his wrist is rotating like this, or he's doing more like this. And then the graph direction will also be changing, which Christoph actually showed in the slide. So you usually want players, if they want more shallowing, you'd want to do more of this motion. So the rotation would be in this direction. So it would be actually clockwise. And the other, of course, is what I showed already in the beginning, is through impact, how much the player is rotating. And there, obviously, it also is affected how much the player rotates his body, but usually right through impact, the dominant part is how much the hands are rotating, actually. So that's why we call it global rotation. And we've selected those two numbers from P6, P7, P7, P8 is around impact is interesting to look at. All right. Then I think, Christoph, you excellently pointed out about this radial and an extension connection. And that's important actually for coaches to know, right, that those are coupled motions. If you try to add more radial, it's the hand goes in extension almost by default.
Yeah.
So
exactly. So I saw talked to a couple of coaches who bought HackMotion recently, and they said, well, the most eye-opening for me was when I figured out how much the radial deviation influenced the extension part. So that I mean, that was something that flashed me when I got HackMotion in the beginning. I knew it's happening, but it was basically, you can see when you work with amateur golfers, it's absolutely nearly a one-to-one correlation, nearly. I'm exaggerating, okay? But the funny thing is, if you work with professional players, you can see good players adding radial deviation and also flexion at the same time. So they're professionals, okay? They can do it.
Yeah, so, that's actually a very good point, and that's also I would point out. Scott Kauk's presentation was very interesting. He has players who hit very long, and they don't add this type of lag. Interestingly, they add both flexion and radial, so they're able to control the club face, but still adding lag. So that's often complete opposite of what typical amateurs do.
Yeah.
Actually, about this topic, maybe Christoph, you can tell about what's the difference in your opinion working with pros and amateurs using HackMotion, and what do you do different there?
Well, when I work with professionals, I don't touch a player before I don't have his wrist data. Okay, so when I work with professional golf, I actually really look when they have problems with ball flight. Sometimes I got some have problems with very low ball flights with the longer irons because they try to have a punchy movement sometimes. I really see a lot of wrist flexion at the impact. Sometimes going to 30, 35 degrees. And I discuss if you want to take out some of this. It's very, very difficult to do that actually for professional players. That's what I really saw, because they obviously hit millions of golf balls in their life. They play for a living, and to change patterns like that is very, very difficult with that speeds they can hit the ball. For some reason, it's easier to change it with amateur golfers. Professionals have to exaggerate much more, and you also have to take sometimes a different approach to change something.
Yeah.
Professionals are a different animal, I would say. Yeah.
I'm looking at some questions from the audience. One is asking, David Stenson's asking about some bunker shot data. Have you actually measured some bunker shot data, and maybe something interesting you can point out about it?
I only measured bunker shot data a couple of times, and the only ones I remember was the ones I did. Actually, I made a YouTube video about this a while ago, but I remember that when I did it, I basically I had a very similar impact alignments than like a setup. So it was very, very similar. So I had some extension in the setup. It nearly had the same extension. Impact rapidly going towards extension, and also the radial ulnar part was very similar. So basically, maybe that's my idea, because I always had the feeling it works best for me when I try to get back to the address position with bunker shots. But I actually wanted to measure more short game shots in the future, so maybe next year I will talk about it a little more thoroughly.
Okay, that sounds like a great idea. And what you mention about the extension makes sense. If you'd want to open more club face in bunker shots, then you'd have usually more extension.
You can go more this way. Yeah, you don't want to hit
exactly
the ground. So it would make sense that you really extend your lead wrist.
Yeah. So that's something that we also could add more in the app. Some bunker shot data we actually have some gathered. Any more questions? One interesting question is about that's popular question. Would you agree correct wrist movements help in body rotation and pivot? And that's, I think, an interesting topic about the connection between wrists and pivot.
Yes, absolutely, and vice versa. So it's
And which one you'd say comes first, correct wrists or correct body?
I think the first thing that comes is intention. The problem is many people absolutely have no idea how their wrist should be structured at certain points in the golf swing, or which roughly where they should be. So they basically normally they grip the club and they just hit it and they don't think, okay, which is okay if they do it correctly, but normally they don't do it. And then they have an intent to do something. The moment they start to have an intent, things change it. Okay, so then they have, maybe he feels, okay, if I want the wrist in this position, I have to be more here with the body and stuff like that. So I actually never saw only working on the body pivot. I mean, I saw it with good players, but for the other players, when I only work on body pivots, I rarely see a massive change. I see some change, but not a massive change in the wrist data. I think you really have to talk about it very exclusively with the amateur golfer. It's not something you're gonna just get overnight. It's not gonna happen. You know, you have to learn it. If you don't do it, for some reason, professional golfers learned it as a kid, hitting millions of golf balls. They found a way to do it. Amateur golfers who start late, they normally don't figure it out by themselves. Many times.
One interesting question, probably final question we can take, is about early casting. how would you use HackMotion data and HackMotion to help player who's actually casting?
To be honest, when I see HackMotion data, somebody's casting, so I see excessive radial ulnar deviation at the beginning of the downswing, I will look a couple things, like, of course, grip first. I will have a look at his flexion extension, because typically when somebody casts the club, you will see in the trail hand that he also goes excessively into palmar flexion this direction and lead wrist extension this way, and that's like a cast move very often. So normally, if you let them work with the trail wrist more into dorsiflexion, more back here, then normally it disappears a lot. And the second thing is, if I have this, I will absolutely check also ground forces, bodies, stuff I also do with my force plates, because many times you see very bad pressure shifts and all that kind of stuff using the ground very badly, and they actually have no chance. But I make sure that they understand the concept of the wrists, and I will add the body things too. It's always, you can't say it's one, it's something that belongs together.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned trail wrist, and that's something that now we are releasing. Christoph has already tried it.
The version,
yeah. So that's something we're looking forward to releasing to wider audience.
I really enjoyed the trail sensor, and I'm very, very sure if you guys can get it later, you will enjoy it as well.
Yep. So thanks a lot, Christoph.
It was a big honor of me talking in this webinar. There are a group of really fantastic coaches I really look up to as well. And so I'm really happy that I was one of them. And thank you very much for inviting me. And everybody else, have a nice day and enjoy the education. Thanks.
Thanks, Christoph.